Formal welcome. My name's David Sutherland. I work for Buckinghamshire Council. I'm one of the senior managers at Buckinghamshire Council, and my role at Bucks Council is to prepare the authority for all, I suppose, the new policy that's come in under the Environment Act. So in terms of nature recovery, that means, I suppose, gearing us up for local nature recovery strategies, and also the really important policy as well of biodiversity net gain in the planning system. So some really big policies that are coming in are going to have an impact. So that's my role. Welcome to those that are still joining. Just in the introductions. So what's going to happen today is, yes, I'm just going to give you an introduction to local nature recovery strategies, what they are, and how to get involved in obviously the one that's being produced for obviously Buckinghamshire, Milton, Keynes. Having myself been one of the pilots that trialled the process around about a year ago, I came to understand the tremendous importance of these as we kind of move forward, and the power that these are going to have, and I suppose importantly the fabulous opportunity that this, I think, presents between us. They are one of the key policies, as I mentioned, of the government, there to, I suppose, support the government's legally binding commitment to reverse nature's decline. And we will see we've seen in the news in terms of nature's decline, but there is now a legally binding commitment for us to kind of reverse that decline, and this is one of the mechanisms of us to do it. And for us to recover, I suppose, nature at the scale that's required, what I suppose we need is targeted, coordinated, and importantly collaborative action together in the right places. And obviously this strategy, I suppose the value of this strategy is it's going to spatially identify those areas and locations where action to restore nature, to create habitats, will be most effectively taken. And it's there as a guide. I think my understanding of it is in terms of a guide, whether it be public, whether it be private, whether it be voluntary sector, whether it be land managers, of how and where we should focus our collective action that's going to have the greatest impact. So for me, that's the value of these. And I really do kind of understand the kind of tremendous value of these. So that's kind of the overview, my introduction, I suppose my passion for this. So actually, if we can move to the next slide, please. So just a bit about who's working. I'm just going to introduce you to a few people from the team who are on the call and who you're going to hear from. But at the essence of local nature recovery strategies, and for these to work, this is all about partnership working. It is about collective action. And a lot of people would like to be involved, would like to understand about this. At its heart, I suppose we have a core team that's leading this. So I suppose myself from Buckinghamshire Council, we have Phil Snell from Milton Keynes City Council. So Phil's on the call. Phil's just given a wave. We have from Natural England. So we have Sarah Smith from Natural England, who I suppose is I like to call her our government advisor in terms of making sure that we're kind of aligning with a government policy. We then, in terms of our kind of our local nature partnership, we have Nicola. So Nicola's just giving you a wave, and Nicola will do a bit of a section in the middle of the presentation. And finally, but not least, we have Saatchi, who is our local nature recovery strategy project manager, who's going to guide us through the whole process. And just, I suppose, surrounding that little core group, we have our steering group, where we also have our local record centre, environmental record centre. We have the Environment Agency, the Wildlife Trust, the Parks Trust, the Conservation Board in terms of our protected landscape, and the Forestry Commission. So that's kind of making sure we've got a collective knowledge to guide this through. But as I say, this is all about partnership working, and for this to work, this needs to be a collective action. So just a little bit about housekeeping before I just kind of go over the agenda. So the session is being recorded, just so for the benefit of those that are unable to attend, we will then send obviously the recording out together with an FAQ sheet on the local nature recovery strategy and any questions that kind of come up as part of these introductory webinars. We'll also place it on the Local Nature Partnerships website, and you will receive a follow-up email in terms of information we don't complete it today. So as I say, your cameras and mics have been turned off just to avoid any background noise. But if you could use the Q&A function, so along the top of your screen, there is hopefully a little Q&A button for you to put your questions in as we go. The team will try and answer them as we go. If not, we will pick up at the Q&A session at the end. If you don't have a Q&A function, please use the chat function. Neither of those will be visible in the recording. Yeah, so please, as you say, just use those two functions. We will have a number of little interactive surveys, interactive polls at 2 points within the webinar. Now there'll be a link placed within the chat, or if you prefer to use a QR code, have your smartphone handy to use that. And at the end of the session, we will set out the links in terms of how to engage with the opportunities with the LNRS as we kind of move forward. So just turning to the agenda, and then I'll hand over to the kind of the wider project team. So just in terms of the format of the webinar, so I suspect within the next half an hour, we'll cover, I suppose, the actual formal presentation, and then we'll come to the question and answer section at the end. The first section, Sarah from Natural England will pick up, and that'll be about what is an LNRS, what is a local niche recovery strategy, what's the process we're following, and why does it matter. What we'll then move on to, Nicola from our local nature partnership. Nicola will then set out, I suppose, just the importance of why this is important for Buckinghamshire, Milton, Keynes, some of our key habitats that we need to protect and restore. And then what will happen is Nicola will then hand over to Saatchi in terms of setting out, I suppose, the opportunities for town and parish councils, and just in terms of how you would like to interact, how would you like to use the local niche recovery strategy as we kind of move forward. So that's the kind of the end section in terms of how to get involved, and then we'll end a bit of a wash up at the end in terms of a Q&A, and hopefully at the end you'll be a lot more informed in terms of what the local niche recovery strategy is and how to engage with the process we're starting. So quickly before I hand over to Sarah, we're going to have a quick poll. And this is, I suppose, a bit of a temperature gauge, just in terms of your knowledge of what a local niche recovery strategy is and why it's important. Some of you may have a lot higher knowledge of local niche recovery strategies. Some of you may be coming at this completely from afresh. And I think we just want to understand where you're coming at these from. So if you could complete the link in the chat or use your smartphone just to go to the poll, that would be great. What will happen is, as we then move through, Saatchi will just put some of the results of that within the chat as we move on with the presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who's just going to then cover what is a local niche recovery strategy and why does it matter. So over to you, Sarah.
Great, thanks, David. So as David mentioned at the start, I'm Sarah and I am from Natural England, here to support Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes through this process. Next slide, please. So local nature recovery strategies are new strategies for nature, and they are legally required by the Environment Act. So every part of England will have an LNRS, and as you've probably picked up by now, our local LNRS covers Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes. So as I said, they're legally required, and this all sits within sort of a bigger policy framework for the environment. So of particular importance up there on the screen is the Environmental Improvement Plan, which came out 6 months ago. It's an update of the 25-year Environment Plan, if you were familiar with that. But what I really wanted to highlight is that it indicates in that plan that local nature recovery strategies are a key mechanism for helping us to achieve our national environmental goals. So the goals set out in that environmental improvement plan are also there on the screen, and you can see there's kind of a bit of a relationship between them, all working towards this apex goal of thriving plants and wildlife. So we are going to be kind of bearing all this in mind, taking this into account as we produce the LNRS. And that's not just that apex goal, that's all of them, well, where they're relevant. And all those goals are also underlain by a number of objectives. So the LNRS is one of those mechanisms that is going to help us deliver on those targets. And also just to highlight that there will be some guidance coming out from government on the relationship between LNRSs and national environmental targets and kind of how we need to take them into account. But yeah, regardless of that, I'm sure that these are all sort of working towards that apex goal anyway. Moving on. So what actually is the LNRS? As I've mentioned, it's this collaborative plan for nature. So it is a collaborative process, which is, you know, why we're starting early now, talking to people like yourselves. It includes two parts. So the actual output is going to have a written part, which is called the Statement of Biodiversity Priorities. And that is looking at what do we already have that's great for nature in the area. Priorities, so what are the top things that we collectively want for nature. Measures, which is how do we get there? So what needs to actually be done to deliver those priorities? And then the second part is a map, and that's called the local habitat map. So again, it starts by looking at what we already have, particularly the sites that are protected already for nature conservation. And then looking at where we can implement those measures from the written part. So where can we implement those that's going to have the biggest difference for nature conservation and also other environmental benefits? So where can we kind of get the biggest bang for our buck by focusing efforts? And just to note as well, there might be some measures that could happen anywhere or sort of a lot across a very large part of the area. So we can still definitely include those, but they don't necessarily need to be mapped. You'll see at the top, there's that pilot LNRS banner. So whilst this is the first time that LNRSs are being prepared and it's very early days, Buckinghamshire, so without Milton Keynes, was one of 5 pilot areas. And the purpose of that pilot was very much to help test the process, and that's informed regulations and guidance that have now been published. But nevertheless, during that process, there was over 1,000 responses from stakeholders, and it led to the identification of 54 priorities and some mapping work about where those might be best placed. So it's not, and it was never intended to be a finished product, but we will look at the data that was collected as well in that pilot process. And kind of review that, see if it's still appropriate, and integrate that with all the new inputs that we get from this process as well. But yeah, just as a sort of a caveat that the exact format and the methods that we use might be different this time round, because we are sort of in the situation has evolved. Next slide, please. So this is a flow diagram of the process. Down the left-hand side is the steps that we need to create the local habitat map, and the right-hand side is are the steps that will lead to the Statement of Biodiversity Priorities. And as I mentioned, those two things collectively make the LNRS. It's expected to take about 12 to 18 months. And I'll just talk you very, very quickly through the steps. So starting with step 1 on the left, that's the mapping of the areas that we already have protected for nature. Moving to step 3, that's the description of the strategy area. So what we've already got again, so there's the mapped bit and the written bit. Step 4, agreeing the priorities and measures. So that's when I say agreeing, as I've mentioned, that's kind of collaboratively with all interested parties and stakeholders in the area. Step 5, mapping that. So taking those agreed priorities and measures, looking at them spatially. And I did deliberately miss out step 2 because the LNRS will be reviewed every 3 to 10 years. And that's where step 2 comes in. So that's looking at what's happened in between. What have we achieved for nature recovery between this very first LNRS and when we come to review it. Next slide, please. So this is just a very quick high-level example of what this could look like. So that priority, that what do we want for nature, could be we want more woodland. The measure, so how are we going to achieve it, might include tree planting to expand and connect existing woodland. And then taking that to the map, well, if we're going to expand and connect existing woodland, we'll need to start with where is existing woodland. But we might also want to think about woodland creation sort of in and around towns, for example, which could provide those extra benefits of things like cleaner air, shade and local cooling. Next slide. So why does the LNRS matter? Sort of why are we doing this? As I've mentioned, there's a kind of overarching government policy and it is a legal requirement, but there's also kind of a lot of other things coming down the pipeline that all interlink with this. So biodiversity net gain, which is the top one there, is a national policy mechanism. It will require development to increase biodiversity by 10%. So the priority is very much for delivering that on the development site itself, but it's considered quite unlikely that the whole gain in every circumstance is going to be able to meet that. So there might be instances of off-site net gain, which is where developers will sort of fund the improvement or habitat or creation of new habitat. And the LNRS is going to be really key to determining where those sites are, particularly because in the way that that net gain is calculated, so there's kind of a set method for calculating it, and that basically rewards developers for directing their off-site net gain to areas that are highlighted in the LNRS. Down to the next point, as per the Environment Act, public authorities who operate in England have to consider what they do to conserve and enhance biodiversity and agree and enact policies to achieve this. So the LNRS obviously form a really kind of good blueprint for where that focus should be. In terms of the planning system, local nature recovery strategies have kind of been designed to integrate with the planning system. So for example, that's why we have the boundaries that we do, because that matches up to the planning areas of Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes. And we are awaiting, so there's going to be some more guidance coming from government on the link between that for local planning authorities and how they have to have regard to the LNRS. But the ambition is certainly there that they are integrated together. Environmental land management schemes are a new system of government grants for farmers and other land managers. And that gives grants to support the delivery of environmental improvements, environmental targets. So it could be things like improved water and air quality or improved biodiversity on their sites. So that's expected to be one of the delivery mechanisms for LNRS. And there's also expected to be sort of a host of future funding, which could include things like biodiversity net gain, like elms, like carbon credits, which is a really growing market, as well as the sort of perhaps more traditional charitable grants. And the idea of the LNRS is that this is kind of funneling them all towards a bigger picture. So there's some really great stuff that's already happening, but the LNRS will kind of make sure that where we're taking action, it all sort of adds up to this cohesive whole big picture. Next slide, please. So what do we mean when we say nature? I'm sure the word nature will conjure up images in everyone's head, and it includes habitats such as wetlands, woodlands, grasslands, and many more, species such as specific animals or plants or fungi. And nature also includes that kind of wider landscape, so nature and geology and soils. And those bits are really important because they determine what habitats and species can actually exist where. And also just to point out that nature doesn't only exist in the countryside. So we will be thinking about both rural and urban nature. Next slide. why is healthy nature important? Again, I'm sure many of you agree that nature is important for its own sake, but as well as that inherent value, it provides us with a whole range of benefits that are essential for us to live and thrive. So those benefits are known as ecosystem services, and you'll probably hear that a bit more throughout this presentation. As shown on the slide there, they're usually grouped into kind of 4 different types: cultural, goods or provisioning services, regulation, and supporting services. But basically, kind of without going into the technicalities of all those, it's really just talking about the fact that nature gives us things like pleasant areas to live and work and socialise, giving us the kind of things we need from nature, so food, water, medicine and other raw materials, giving us clean air and water, and then that supporting services of all the underlying processes that mean that nature functions properly so it can provide us with all of this wonderful stuff. So obviously for town and parish councils, these are probably all important, but perhaps there's kind of your idea of the cultural services, the beauty of your local area, your local green spaces, and maybe a bit of that environmental regulation, particularly, you know, with climate change. Nature can really help to manage some of the impacts of that by providing local cooling, so having street trees to lower the local temperature and things like that. On that note, I will pass over to Nicola to give you a little bit of an overview of the nature in Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So just to recap, I'm Nicola Thomas. I'm the Partnership Manager for the Bucks and Milton Keynes Natural Environment Partnership, which is the local nature partnership that covers the area. And we're leading the work on the LNRS on behalf of Bucks and Milton Keynes Councils. We're also involved in the pilot, so bringing a lot of lessons learned from the Buckinghamshire pilot. So Sarah's outlined what an LNRS is and the various links to wider government policy and some of the sort of role of nature in terms of the benefits that it provides to us. And my role here is really to give you a little bit more information on why we're putting together a strategy for nature's recovery. So I'm going to give you a reminder of the habitats and species, key habitats and species in our area, why they matter, an acknowledgement of the threats that we face, and therefore, you know, why the LNRS is important and why it's important to get involved in the process. At the end of this section, we will be asking you what nature recovery means to you. And that's because the guidance asks us to come up with a collaborative understanding of nature recovery. So as I go through my slides, perhaps you'd like to have a little think about nature recovery, what that means, and there'll be a poll at the end of this section, again with a QR code, and we'll put a link into the chat. And we'd really like you to put your ideas into there when that becomes available. So what nature do we have on our doorstep? So these couple of pie charts really illustrate the sort of similarities and differences between the Buckinghamshire area and the Milton Keynes area in terms of some really broad land cover types and landscape types. So this isn't meant to be a very detailed look at biodiversity value. These are broad categories, and at that level you can see various similarities and differences. So for example, around 2/3 of each area by land area is covered with cultivated land or amenity and improved grassland. The proportions differ slightly in Milton Keynes to Bucks, but you can see that 2/3 of the area is roughly covered by those two categorisations. And there are some differences, such as Bucks has a bit more woodland, trees, scrub and hedgerows. Milton Keynes is a bit more built up. But essentially these do show that both areas have a variety of habitats and land use. So let's have a look at some of our key habitats in a bit more detail and talk through what we can find there and why they're beneficial. So woodland, first of all, this is a picture from Ashridge, which reminds us that we have lots of patches of woodland, but also ancient woodland in our area. We have some former royal hunting forests, for example, across the area. Species in these kinds of woodlands, various rare species of mammals, such as the hazel dormice, various species of bats and rare butterflies. The Aylesbury Vale, some of you will know, has a particular tree that's nationally significant and declining, the black poplar tree. And in terms of the wider benefits of woodland, some examples, aside from providing habitat for nature, obviously provides raw material in the form of timber, but also potential for carbon capture, providing us with shade, improving our air quality and reducing flood risk and soil erosion, depending on where the trees and woodlands are planted. So lots of benefits to all of us. Okay, moving to the next habitats. This is really the landscape of the Chilterns, a very specialised and fragile landscape. And within there we have chalk grassland, which is a managed landscape, and these landscapes that host a wide variety of specialised plants, including orchids, as well as butterflies and various invertebrates. The Chilterns is where you'll find the county flower of Buckinghamshire, the Chilterns gentian. That's obviously the only place in the UK where you can find that flower. And in terms of some of the ecosystem services or these wider benefits of that landscape, aside from providing these habitats for wildlife, clearly as the picture shows, services for pollinators. So our pollinators are obviously really important for crop growth and various other types of plant growth. And the Chilterns is a very big visitor attraction, so providing health and wellbeing benefits to visitors. Staying with the Chilterns, just moving on to another really important habitat there are chalk streams, like the River Chess, which is the one in the picture here. They're an internationally rare habitat, and most of the world's chalk streams are found in England, and many of those are in the Chilterns. And they have sort of unique conditions and properties which give rise to a huge range of aquatic plants, such as watercress, animals such as the water vole, important fish populations such as brown trout and various aquatic invertebrates. In terms of wider benefits, clearly important for wildlife, but also health wellbeing benefits for visitors. Staying with the water environment, moving on to rivers and all the associated types of water environment and wetlands. So I'm thinking about large river systems, such as the Great Ouse, River Tame, River Ray, and the River Thames along the bottom southern border of Bucks. And also thinking of the wider water network, so other water bodies, various tributary streams, ponds, the slow-flowing brooks in Aylesbury Vale, and the associated wetland habitats. So really important for wildlife, fish, plants, invertebrates in the water itself, but surrounding wetland can be really important for a number of species, including wading birds, such as the lapwing and curlew, particularly out in the floodplain meadow grasslands of the Ray Valley, for example. And wider benefits, clearly a source of water. Wetlands can also help manage flood risk, and all these types of waterscapes can attract visitors so they're really important to us all for health, wellbeing and recreation. And again, these are just example types of habitat. There are a huge number of habitats I could have picked on, but just to give you pick out some of the key ones across the area. So let's move on to thinking about our urban nature, which is obviously also important, as Sarah was mentioning. Habitats here, such as parks, gardens, street trees, really important benefits to people. It's where they find nature on their doorstep for those who live in that area, and also obviously therefore very important for local climate regulation, providing shade, improving air quality, perhaps attracting those pollinators, acting as noise barriers, and obviously making places very attractive to live and work. So as I said, there are lots of habitats in that area. I can't possibly go through all of them in the presentation, but just to mention a few others. Hedgerows, very important. We've reputedly got England's oldest hedge in our area in Princess Risborough. Traditional orchards, arable field margins with their rare arable weeds, ancient box woodland, and of course we've got some really beautiful areas of parkland and protected areas that we could mention too. So I think the message, and we'll just move to the next slide, the message here is nature is all around us, it's precious, it provides many benefits, but it is under threat. So globally, we're in the middle of a mass extinction event. 41% of our species in the UK have declined in recent decades. Locally, all our chalk streams need improving, and we're losing plant species at a higher rate than most other counties. And these pressures that are acting on nature are coming from all different scales. So clearly, a big one, climate change. Warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier summers have implications for which species are going to survive, how resilient they are, what kind of pests and diseases might be coming our way, and invasive non-native species too. More locally, local pressures, you can look at development as a potential pressure on our habitats, and nature could lead to habitat loss if not managed, and the population increases through an influx of people to our area. Again, we need to be really careful about the increased demand for resources, particularly water, and the potential for more waste and pollution. We also need to be thinking about how we manage our land so that that's done well for nature. If not, particularly land around water systems could risk the quality of water and the water hydrology, and changes in land ownership can lead to habitat fragmentation, which can lead to less connected habitats. So lots and lots of different types of pressures acting on nature at all scales. We do recognise lots of great work is being done already to address some of the challenges across Bucks and Milton Keynes, and the local nature recovery strategy will form this kind of cohesive and collaboratively agreed strategic plan so that all of these efforts and future efforts work together for maximum impact. So that's gone through a little bit about why nature is important, the fact it's under threat, and what can we do to help in terms of the local nature recovery strategy. So now we come to the link and the QR code to our poll. What does nature recovery mean to you? So please do go ahead and fill that poll in while I just give you a little bit of background about the yellow box you see on your screen. So this working definition of what we've come up with as a steering group so far, and with some of our working groups in particular. So we have emphasised working together. We've emphasised repairing and creating resilient habitats and landscapes. We've emphasised more wildlife and those wider benefits for all across the entire LNRS area. So if you've got thoughts to add to this in terms of what nature recovery means to you and what you think about when we say recovering nature, we really want to hear from you. So say the guidance requires us to come up with this collaborative view, and so it's really important that we hear from you in this poll. So thank you in advance, and please feel free to keep answering that as I pass over to Saatchi, who will be talking about how to get involved with the LNRS process. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nicola. So I'm just going to quickly read through some of the responses that we have been getting from the poll, and thank you so much for your contributions. The idea here is to incorporate them in that definition that basic definition that we already have on screen, so that they reflect a collective vision definition for nature recovery. Some things that are coming up include collective action for the long term, balance, restoring and improving habitats to allow wildlife populations to grow, influencing planning applications, improvement of existing sites, but also avoiding destruction of key sites via development, recover that delivers max wider environmental benefits, providing opportunities for flora and fauna. Great, thanks so much. We will definitely be looking through all your responses and seeing how we can integrate them into developing this collective definition. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why you might want to get involved in the LNRS process and how you could possibly do that. So, as was mentioned previously, ecosystem services such as flood mitigation or green space for health and well-being affects everyone. And knowing which ecosystem services or habitats or species are most valuable to local residents will really help us ensure that we're including them in the LNRS. Priorities in the LNRS really need to reflect local needs, and as representatives of town parish residents, we really are here today requesting your support to understand what your constituents value the most in terms of nature and what they want to see for the future. The LNRS could have an impact on how nature is managed throughout the area. In fact, it will. And so we really want to hear from you so that we make decisions for the LNRS that align with local needs. Just to say that at this point, the LNRS may not be able to include specific pieces of nature such as local greens or ponds in your towns or parishes. However, if certain types of ecosystems are identified as a priority based on what you tell us, you could use the LNRS as evidence for action and the LNRS delivery mechanisms outlined previously as potential funding sources to restore nature in your areas. So in terms of how you might want to get involved, and again, this is sort of equally a question to you as it is certain opportunities that we can provide at this point. Just to caveat by saying that we are at an early stage in developing the LNRS. We did go through the pilot process and we will incorporate some of those learnings and the data that came out of that. However, since our current LNRS area also includes Milton Keynes, and this is sort of the final process in developing the LNRS, we are still at an early stage. And at this point, we'd really like to hear your views on which parts of nature are most important to preserve, improve, restore, because of the various ecosystem services that it provides, or because it's valuable inherently to your particular area. And this will inform a series of priorities for nature, as well as the measures that can be taken to achieve these goals. So the best way for you to quickly provide some information about what is important for you with ReNature is to take a quick survey. So there is a link in the chat, and then there's a QR code on the screen. If you could take this quick survey today, that would be fantastic. The other opportunity is to join a stakeholder consultation group specifically for town and parish councils. This will meet for about 2 hours in November of this year and June of next year to review the LNRS and ensure that your priorities for nature are really being met. As this is an iterative process, we need to ensure that we're including what local residents and what local towns and parishes want. The other question is, would you be interested if we put together a funding list that could point you towards funding opportunities to help implement the priorities of the LNRS? And again, we'd love to hear from you about how else you might want to be engaged. And equally, we hope that you will be champions for the LNRS. We do have a similar survey for residents. If you could encourage residents in your area to take the survey, that would be fantastic, and we'll send a follow-up email with some of this information as well. We also encourage you to tell other councillors, your colleagues, other people in the area. We also have surveys for NGOs and businesses if you are connected with local NGOs or businesses in your area. And again, we'll send a follow-up email to provide you with all the necessary information to talk about the LNRS to others. And yes, again, if we could really, we'd love for you to take the survey, and that would be really helpful. And you can answer all of these other questions through the survey as well. I'm now going to move to the Q&A section of this webinar. And so if you put in questions in the chat, we can, or in the Q&A section, we'll pick them up. And if we're unable to get to all your questions today, we'll definitely make sure to email you responses as well. So there is a question in the chat about why the Colne Valley Parks Trust are not included in the group. So we are actually engaged with the Colne Valley Parks Trust. So the way we're approaching this is by is as a contingent of responsible authorities. So since the Colne Valley neighbours has borders with a number of different responsible authorities, Greater London, Berkshire, Oxfordshire, Hertfordshire and Surrey, we're working together along with the Parks Trust, the Colne Valley Parks Trust, to come up with a collective strategy for a collective LNRS space priority for the Colne Valley area. So there are a few more questions in the chat. How do we get access to the mapping that you refer to? So the mapping has not been produced yet. We're in the process of producing that. It will go alongside with the statement of written statement of priorities that we're developing for the LNRS. So as and when we put that together, there will be a version of it that is publicly accessible. But equally, the survey asks if there are any particular functions or a format for the mapping and the written statement of priorities that would be particularly helpful for you in terms of how you might be able to use it or how you would like to use it. So if you can, again, answer that question, that would really help us in developing the functionality of the map as well. I don't know if anybody else wants to, David, do.
So just on that map, so it is worth having a look at the outputs from the pilot LNRS in terms of the baseline map, because a lot of the baseline information will be the same. So I think it's worth having a look at that, albeit obviously that wasn't for Milton Keynes, but by all means look at that. And I have also posted a link in the chat just in response to Marcus's question in terms of the natural capital mapping work that's available. So there is existing mapping work available, but obviously I suppose the baseline report for the mapping, yeah, that obviously that's to follow, but there's a lot of published mapping work that you can look back on. I think that's just what I'd say. So thanks, Archie.
Thanks, David. Can I also ask you to respond, David, to a question about whether there's a way of having neighborhood plans linked in with the LNRS?
So I think that's a really great question. And I think, as Sarah indicated, obviously the way that the structure of local nature recovery strategies has been set up in terms of the guidance and the regulation, that they are to work, I suppose, hand in hand with the planning system at all levels, whether that be, I suppose, at a local plan level, and I suppose all the way down to neighbourhood plans. So in answer to your question, yes, you know, that would be great. And that's, I think, how we envisage one of the ways with which the local nature recovery strategy is being used. You know, we kind of see it that the local nature recovery strategy will set the overall framework, you know, in terms of that collective vision of where, for instance, habitat should be created, restored, of which can then be picked up. You know, you can see where those spatial areas are, and you can then pick up those, I suppose, the more detail within your neighbourhood plan. So yes, fundamentally, we are still waiting for that detailed guidance from the government in terms of the interaction between local nature recovery strategies and the planning system. So I think we will follow that up with further information to you as we just communicate through the process. But absolutely, there is a way that we envisage that kind of working together. So thank you for that really good question.
Thanks, David. There's also another question I'm going to forward to you about whether there's any way for parish or town councils to benefit from biodiversity net gain credit scheme, and is there a good source of information or training for this?
So another great question. So again, local nature recovery strategies and biodiversity net gain have been designed to work hand in hand, i.e. the areas that we are spatially identifying for habitat creation, that's where we want, I suppose, any off-site biodiversity net gain to be delivered. So if you know, a developer is required to deliver 10% on site, they can't do that. They're going to have to buy from an off-site location, of which, you know, we will spatially identify as part of the local nature recovery strategy where it makes sense to do that. So that's, I suppose, the process. We'll post a link within here in terms of the information that we have available on biodiversity net gain. Again, that there's a lot of emerging guidance coming out in terms of how the off-site market is going to be set up and the process by which developers are able to purchase units. Effectively, you know, they're going to be legal agreements for 30 years on those pieces of land that have to be registered with Natural England and suitably regulated. I will post a link so you can kind of get some further information on that. But we'll put some further communication out on biodiversity net gain because it's a really important policy, and people do want to understand in terms of how it works and how it kind of and how they kind of fit into that process. So that's definitely one we'll follow up with a Q&A.
Thanks, David. Sarah, a question for you. Do you have a link for ELMS to see if we can access any funding?
Yeah, so I've just popped some information on that in the chat. But yeah, the second link is quite detailed. So if you prefer to just sort of talk it through with one of my colleagues who focuses in that area, then just drop me an email and I can connect you up.
Thanks, Sarah. We have a Milton Keynes specific question that asks that we have lots of ecosystems threatened by development and the MKSPD, which cuts across ecosystems, bulldozes hedgerows, and prioritizes grid roads rather than the current layout of fields and hedgerows. Can we change the SPD to be more environmentally friendly? Phil, would you like to take that one?
Yes, well, hedgerows are protected. They are protected in the local plan and they do have status. It is problematic on developments and sometimes they can be removed. We would normally expect them to go down, but they are protected in numerous ways. They're not mentioned specifically in the supplementary planning guidance because they're already protected under the local plan. They're already protected under law if they meet the standard of a protected hedgerow. Biodiversity net gain has been part of Milton Keynes local plan for at least the last 5 years. We do ask for a metric on it. So, you know, from an ecology point of view, we will always try and defend it. But of course, planning is about balancing outcomes. That's not wholly within the ecology department. That's, you know, a whole planning view. But as I say, biodiversity net gain has been in Milton Keynes for, you know, the last 5 years. So we were quite far ahead of many other local authorities in ensuring that wildlife is in a better condition than they started with. You have to bear in mind that Milton Keynes is an area of significant development, but we will obviously defend it wherever we can and would obviously see the hedgerows go back where they are removed. Sometimes it is for things like site visibility when they go in and out of a site at the beginning, and the hedgerows we would then expect to come back. So they're protected in numerous ways. So.
Thank you, Phil. There's a question about whether there's potential to integrate the district licensing scheme for great crested newts into the LNRS. So we are actually speaking with the council's department that works on conserving great crested newts and their partners. So that is definitely something that we're looking into. And equally, we will be looking into other aquatic species as well that fall within the priority habitats. Okay. All right, there's another question about biodiversity net gain, which I'm going to forward to you, David. Off-site BNG plans seem entirely illogical to me, at least. Once the habitat is destroyed, it's most unlikely to recover 100%. Also, current BNG metrics do not appear to include the new use of a site. For example, destroying mature trees in grasslands and replanting a few new trees plus a hedge in and around a huge new car park is not logical BNG improvement.
Thanks, Sachin. Thanks just for the question on that. So the whole, I suppose, biodiversity net gain policy is not there or doesn't replace existing protections or, I suppose, of the environment. And in terms of the hierarchy of how we want net gain delivered, fundamentally, we want this delivered on site first and foremost. Off site is almost a kind of a mechanism of almost last resort if they can't do it on site. And I have to say, having introduced it into the planning system, most kind of developers are now factoring it into the design of their site in terms of how they're doing it. And obviously the way the metric works, it has to be a measurable 10% increase on the kind of the baseline in relation to the new use as well. So, you know, yes, that's kind of how it works. So I just, in terms of just reassurance to you in terms of obviously how it's working, how it's designed to work. Yes, off-site is a kind of you know, that it's kind of lower down the threshold, and it's going to be much more expensive for the developer to deliver biodiversity net gain off-site. So you know, it's in the developer's interest to deliver it on site as much as possible. And there are also mechanisms within the Environment Act to prevent developers, I suppose, if they were so inclined, to kind of trash a site before development. So, you know, that's already taken into account in terms of the legislation and us going back in terms of designing it. So, and I think I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing coming through the planning system in terms of how developers are approaching this. And the seriousness of this, you know, it is a big new policy, and in terms of obviously measurable improvement of biodiversity net gain in development. So I hope that answers your question. Happy to take up any follow-up questions on net gain after this. Thanks, Archie.
Sarah, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, just to quickly add that I think if I've understood the question properly, so you do have to take account in the metric, even if you're delivering BNG offsite, you have to take account of what's on that offsite area already. And also mainly just to flag that there's also an evaluation process of this within Natural England. So the metric becomes mandatory in November, and we are going to have an evaluation programme, so we will kind of be going back and just checking that things are working as they are expected to work as well.
Thank you, Sarah. There is another question about BNG that says national legislation does not appear to prevent developers from clearing sites of all habitat years before they are required to submit an ecology report with a planning application.
So obviously the Environment Act does include a provision to prevent that. So obviously there's a date that's put in the Environment Act, which we're able to go back to in terms of the baseline if inadvertently that does happen. We're not seeing that, and so there's a mechanism that's been introduced in the legislation to prevent that happening. If it does, the process we go and say no, that's the baseline that you need to do. So there's a mechanism built in to prevent that happening.
Thanks, David. There's a question about how can we protect trees with TPOs, 150-year-old oak, given permission to be cut down for one resident? Is there any way to appeal and take account of environmental impact? It seems that is ignored. Sarah or Nicola, would you want to comment on that?
I don't mind picking that up, Sachi.
Sure.
I mean, I think I don't know the background of that particular case or that particular planning application. You know, it obviously is down to the planning authority in respect to that particular application in terms of you obviously have the national planning policy, the national planning framework, all those policies the planners would have to take into account in terms of if there was a TPO on site. So I don't think it's helpful to us to comment on a particular planning application, the decisions that reach it, other than to say that, you know, local nature recovery strategies are in addition to all those existing protections. This is a kind of a new policy that's there, I suppose, to support that wider collective action. So I think I just put it in that context, if that's okay.
Thank you, David. If there are any last questions before we close, may I request you to pop them into the Q&A section of the chat. There's a question about what the next steps regarding implementation are. So currently we're in the strategy writing phase, and that will be over the next 12 to 18 months, and implementation will work after we've actually gone through the process of writing the strategy. Sarah, did you want to say anything else about this?
Yeah, I mean, kind of just as has already been mentioned, this is the very kind of start of the process, and there will be, this is also not the only time that we want to talk to you all. We absolutely want input throughout the process, so the kind of exact sort of formats and timings for that are still being worked out, but we will definitely. So if in the survey there's a question about to kind of, you can put your email in if you want to keep updated, so do that, and we'll be back to you with more information.
Yeah, and in terms of sort of immediate next steps, we will be hosting stakeholder consultation workshops in November and in June of next year. So if you'd like to be involved, we'd really encourage you to attend those and let us register your interest through the survey. There's another question about, is there anything we can do to protect current ecosystems from developers felling mature existing trees and hedgerows and replacing them with 10-centimeter seedlings?
So I think, Sachi, if I pick this one up, so I think it's going to be helpful just in terms of the level of questions that have come out on biodiversity net gain. I think is, and then clearly there's obviously massive interest in it, and obviously how it's going to work and how it doesn't work. If we do some, I think, some follow-up communication and sessions in terms of just how it operates, how to get involved, I think, and understanding. So it's clearly kind of come out from today that there's that level of interest in terms of how I suppose the biodiversity net gain is going to work once it becomes mandatory. So we've definitely picked that up. We'll follow that up and get some communication out on that. Just looking at the time, I'm conscious we've got 2 minutes to go. I'm firstly just very grateful for your attendance today, in terms of your understanding of what the local nature recovery strategy is, how you can engage, how you would like to use it, and how we can make it, I suppose, a product, a map and a strategy that suits your purposes kind of moving ahead. So please, we will follow up with the slides. We will follow up with a link to the survey. Please do kind of fill that out. That's going to give us absolutely invaluable insight as we kind of move forward with the process. And we kind of look forward to working with you at the various points in the strategy as we kind of move forward and ultimately to kind of implementation. But thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your questions. And we look forward to communicating with you soon on the project. So thank you very much.